kind of setting the stage right now of what the logic was for the experiment. Not flawless logic, like pretty poorly designed experiments, but still interesting to just like kind of set the groundwork for it. The resource distribution is one part of this experiment that was actually then carried out. He basically takes a ton of rats and he puts them into a barn with unlimited food, unlimited water, and then no predator threat. And so this is like kind of like he's trying to jump over this particular theory, right? And so there's like nothing else extra there. So it's a weird, like, again, I think it's inherently flawed thought experiment, but his idea then is, if all the like good things are there, how will overcrowding affect the species? And what it ends up being is you know, not good, but it turns out too it's been impossible to replicate. So there's a lot of questions to be asked. Like tons of different rats, like overloading it and then making it so they have unlimited food and water, and then seeing how they behave, and that's caused like a huge change in behavior. Yeah, this experiment was done first in rats in the 40s, and then the guy tried to reproduce those experiments with mice in the 60s, and then in the early 70s, a different researcher tried to reproduce it with high school students. It was a whole thing. Yeah, Dame Karen, the jump to humans was, again, like, they were measuring stress and overcrowding on high school students, and there's a lot wrong with the experimental design, but then also they claimed they got opposite results of what the rat experiments showed. So it's all like a weird thing. It like isn't at all ideal. We're talking about the setup for the experiment, which was talking about how there are different stages of population growth, and that kind of influences the stages at which, like why the researcher had this idea.
The second transition stage started. Better food supplies, hygiene and medicine meant people stopped dying all the time, especially so at a very young age. The result was a population explosion, doubling the UK.
I agree, Maddie. I agree. I'm not using this video as like a fact statement, but rather setting the stage for the mentality that the researcher had for doing his experiment. Because I think that some of the flawed logic in this is present in the logic of Calhoun when he was designing his rat study and when he did his rat study. And so the idea that there shouldn't be, like, he wanted to skip these stages of there being resource scarcity and just assume, like, if the end goal is the lack of resource scarcity that could allow for a population explosion, then what would happen? So he wanted to do that, the long-term modeling on it. Granted, like, again, I think it's an inherently flawed theory, but that's where his, like, mindset came from it. And so, like, that's why I picked this particular one to talk about, because this is, like, more looking closer at how... Oh, there you go, Mr. Hamill. There are the ants. So you can see how, like, why that worked. Yeah, so Dame Karen, not at all saying that he is in any way correct, but this is very similar to the mindset that the researcher had. And so that's why I wanted to kind of set the stage with that, because it's like setting the historical context for that as well. But I will say, while there was a lot wrong with the experiment, getting rid of the variable of having to have resource scarcity wasn't a bad approach. It just then became like it's just there's a lot in the setup that was really, really off. You could actually do the same experiments with fruit flies and ants if you really wanted to. We'll actually have a video on what happened, like, so you can model overcrowding and isolation in ants and fruit flies, as a matter of fact, and they have very similar behavioral changes as in humans and rats, so you don't have to do that kind of like really intense like mammalian experiments. It was a scary movie, Kixie, and it also has a lot of scary science based off it. Like that whole Rat City, Kixie, that's what we're kind of like gearing up to talk about, was based on a real experiment that had a lot of ethical issues brought up with it, but at the time, it wasn't considered to be an ethical problem in the 40s and the 60s when these experiments are done. Yeah, rats are super smart. Rats are actually smarter than mice. Most mouse models in labs, mice have like genetic problems that make them like not attuned to certain kinds of learning, versus rats are always like super smart because they're not as inbred as mice were. Like mice like collected from like shops and pet stores were so inbred that there is one particular example of the researchers were trying to prove that it couldn't learn, and years later it was proven actually the mice could learn. It's just the experiment that was being done on them was using auditory cues, and the mice were actually deaf. It was a thing, but they didn't know, because like they're just like, oh, the mutant mouse isn't reacting, and therefore it must be the gene that's like we found a mouse that doesn't remember or can't learn. But it was because the senses that took to learn they didn't have. No, there's a bunch of issues with this hypothesis, Maddie, but again, this was referenced in the paper by Calhoun, which was the original, like, gosh, what was the name of it? This insane term, the behavioral sink study, like destroying the human society, breakdown of human society as a function of overcrowding. So I just was like, all right, well, this video actually like very much explains his reasoning behind it. But again, like, there's a lot of fault behind each of these. So Caledon, in this particular instance, the measure of fertility isn't genetic fitness. It's just the rate of kids that people are having. But fertility can mean very different things in different fields. This is much more of a psychological study that they're talking about versus more of the biology side of things. Fertility means like the ability, like how fertile you are, is how, like in a fruit fly, it's like how many eggs does that fruit fly lay? Is like you can have a measure of fertility. Or like if you do egg counts in the ovary of a fruit fly and you compare the numbers, that's much more of the fertility measurement there, versus like in this kind of like human psychology level, they're not actually measuring like, you know, the average number of eggs per female, or like the scoring the sperm motility and viability, and like, because that would be much more in my mind what fertility means. It's just like how many kids are being had, but it's setting the foundation for the hypothesis that this researcher at Calhoun had, which was, okay, if this is true, he didn't predict that it would ever flatline out. He predicted that overcrowding would lead to civilization collapse. And so the way he also had the same mindset of, okay, how the society is growing and the economic need for everything, if we get rid of that by having unlimited food and water, then we've bypassed a lot of steps with it. This way, he's simulating it all with mice. Definitions of what people deem as valuable is also really hard, I find. Like, one could argue, if you ask my mom, that me streaming on Twitch and talking science is not valuable, and therefore if I made a living out of it, I would be a useless human being. On the other hand, if you ask someone else may say, actually, it's doing betterment for science and science education, therefore it is a beneficial thing, right? So valuability is all like it's very, very different like ideas, right? Is that Malthus, like when we have mass die-offs because of too many people? So this wasn't even mass die-offs, Hanny. This was fundamental changes in behavior. Let's get to the experiment. There is a documentary on the actual researcher. I don't know if we'll actually watch it tonight. I will post it on the Discord if anyone is interested. It's like a documentary from, I think, the 80s. So it's a pretty old documentary, but it has some of the original footage of the researchers doing their thing. Or we have a mass die-off because of COVID. Yep. This population correction, though, as Maddie suggests, it was very, very different in the experiment. This one actually led to what Calhoun argued was irreversible changes, and that's again why he coined the term behavioral sink, that the behavior of these animals could not be rescued, and it led to just like a full collapse of their society. Let's go ahead and get into the experiment. This is the whole study that the Secret of NIMH was based off of.
In 1968, an expert on animal behavior and population control called John B. Calhoun built what was essentially a utopia for mice that was purpose-built to satisfy their every need.
That's the utopia. That looks actually very, very much like one of the settings for the Secret of NIMH movie. Sociopolitical, socioeconomic, actually there's a bit of both. There's always interactions on both fronts. So Maddie, there is the actual image. This is a fascinating, I think, paper. Yeah, 2 years, everyone was dead.
Calhoun's mouse utopia was built with the needs of its mouse inhabitants firmly in mind.
And I will say, his first experiments were with rats in the 40s. And then the second series, 20 years later, were with mice. And yes, mice do die in 2 years, Maddie, but there are males and females here. So they should have been reproducing like bunny rabbits. So it should have been like, the hypothesis was it was going to simulate the planet where you start off with some individuals and they start like breeding like crazy, and then it's just like expansion of population, and now there's no like anything extra happening in terms of like worry on what you have and what you don't have, because like there's no resource scarcity either.
This means 256 boxes in total, each capable of holding 15 mice.
But yeah, so he had a prediction of how many mice could reliably and well live in this area. Yes, Dame Karen, he thought it was going to be a utopia. Calhoun had an apocalyptic idea of collapse. The data on the predictions in the last video came from the Roslin Foundation are very different. They predict that we say, yes, so that's the difference, Cliff, that we were pointing out, that there was a difference in the two endpoints, right? So there was the setup for the two arguments is very similar, but the endpoints are different, right? So while the video we just watched argued that there's a stabilization event that happens, this researcher, not the guy in the video, but Calhoun, argued that there was no stabilization that was going to happen. It is good and claustrophobic, Grimly, just like in the movie.
Prior to creating Universe 25, Calhoun had performed a number of similar experiments with rodents way back in the 1940s. All of these ended in failure when the population either stalled or turned on itself. For example, in one experiment, Calhoun created an enclosure that could easily have housed 5,000 rats, but the eventual population never rose above 200 despite unlimited food, unlimited water, and a complete absence of any predators or any threats. Furthermore,
that was the original experiment that he was... We will go into the data of that one as well and what actually happened, but that was more than one of what the movie was based off of. But the results here with the mice had similar end bits to it of like mouse and rat societal collapse, as what he phrased.
Calhoun's experiments eventually caught the eye of the National Institute of Mental Health.
NIMH, Secret of NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health.
For NIMH, who were intrigued about the observed effects of overpopulation in rodents, specifically if any of the observed phenomenon could be applied to humans. To this end, the NIMH gave Calhoun access to a small piece of land that they owned in Maryland and the funding that was needed to construct Universe 25. Social bonds broke down, and male mice, without a reason to defend their territory or food source since both were plentiful, became dejected, forming cliques that randomly attacked one another for seemingly no reason.
So, breakdown of society is being modeled here. So, in crowding, certain insects cause locusts. What do you mean, Hanny? Locust is an insect. So, what do you mean? There are negative effects of having crowding in insects, overcrowding, in terms of there can be shortened lifespan due to stress. And there could also be limitations in resources. But then the other side, too, is not good, where isolation can cause negative effects as well.
Slowly but surely, both males and females simply stopped breeding. In the lead-up...
And the stop breeding that he's talking about is interesting because the experimenters actually did check fertility later on. And it wasn't that they were infertile, it's just they stopped mating and interacting. Yeah, Dame Karen, it's weird though, right? Like, so there was no real explanation why this happened, and there were subsequent follow-ups and more controlled experiments where, you know, this is like ethical questions that you're just like, now we know you can't overcrowd mice and rats because they like will lead to breakdown and fights, and you have a certain level of like living accommodations you do for mammalian studies, and you make sure the rats are cared for. There's rules governing that on the university level as well as the like the national level of like from research money that comes out from, so that we wouldn't have experiments like this anymore today. But there are interesting questions that arise, and what was interesting is if they took out a mouse from this unit and put it with an established colony in the lab that didn't have this kind of exposure to this quote-unquote utopia, that mouse that's transplanted never recovered in terms of behavior. It never reverted behaviorally to being what it was pre-utopia.
Most intriguing of all were a small group of males and females who withdrew themselves from mouse society altogether to live in the upper levels of the enclosure that Calhoun described as the beautiful ones. These mice did nothing but sleep, eat, and groom themselves, and this gave them noticeably smoother-looking coats, which, along with their isolation meaning no scars from attacks, led to their nickname. They seemingly lost interest in all meaningful social bonds and refused to interact or mate. The last birth in Universe 25 took place on day 600, and from that moment on, the population it slowly dwindled. Even when the population rescinded to levels where the mice had previously flourished, they refused to breed or go back to their old way of interacting.
So that was kind of the argument that he was having, is that the lack of interaction, that social behavior that is critical to the survival of the species, started to break down, and that's what led to the end of that little utopia that they built.
To try and find ways to keep the mice from going down the extinction path, even as the population density grew. And, in fact, he had some success at this. For instance, in one case, via simply encouraging creativity in certain mice by various means. Giving them a sort of purpose here, it actually worked, with the creative mice continuing to thrive well beyond what would have otherwise been expected from the previous experiments.
So the creativity is actually now a standard of being put into like the housing care for the mice. There needs to be some level of enrichment activity for the mice to stimulate their brains, and one of those are like beads hanging from the ceiling, and they just interacting with the beads.
Now, if you enjoyed watching today's episode, and hey, look, here you are at the end of it, then the chances are that you like it when complex concepts like societal structure are broken down and made easy to understand, and that's where today's sponsor, Brilliant, comes into the picture.
So, pretty remarkable. There's a second one of this as well, so that I wanted to look at. So this is looking more at the rat component versus just the mouse component. And this is a researcher just like chatting about what the approach was and what exactly came to be. Thanks for watching SciAntsMedia, and be sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons to help our channel grow and support our science outreach and education goals. We can be found on Twitch most days of the week, and be sure to join us here for our next video. Thanks again, and stay curious, everyone.